in the chat. So, as I said, good morning. Welcome all to our final session of the Foundational Community Supports Golden Thread of Documentation webinar series. Our final session is on providing and documenting services. Just for our general housekeeping, I do want to acknowledge that today's webinar is hosted by DBHR through the Washington State Healthcare Authority. This is an interactive training, and we encourage you to ask questions and participate throughout the session. The slides, as well as the link to the recording of this webinar, will be sent by email after the presentation by Washington State. Just a brief note about artificial intelligence. So please note that the use of automated note-taking bots or similar tools during Washington FCS events or meetings requires prior approval. Any unauthorized use of such tools is prohibited to ensure the privacy and confidentiality of all attendees. Also, any recording that is created through AI is not recognized as an official recording of this session. We reserve the right to exit trainees from the training if they are using AI to take notes without prior approval or using AI to record the session. So I did increase my volume, Dawn. Can you hear me a little bit better now? I hope. All right, hold on 1 second. I'm gonna pause the recording for a second. All right, now that we have that figured out and settled, let's get into our training series overview. So as I said, this is our final session. We have made it. Thank you all so much for being with us for the past 6 weeks. We made it through our sessions on introducing the Golden Thread, the assessment process, and prioritizing areas of need. We talked about the individualized service plan. We talked about how to apply SMART framework to service plans. Last week, Crystal talked about ISP intervention development, and now we're going to round it out, right? Everything that we've talked about in previous sessions is really going to come into play in our final session, because now in this session, we're going to talk about how we're providing those services and then how we're documenting those services. So very briefly, my name is Emily Bands. I am a lecturer here in the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. I am joined by my colleague, Earl Leach, and he's here for any additional technical support or any support through the chat if you have any questions. So we're gonna just do a brief learning application review. Last week, we asked folks if they had the opportunity to try to plan and teach a skill using the skills teaching template. So I did just want to get a quick gauge from the audience. First, if anybody was able to use the skills teaching template that we shared last week, was anybody able to use that to teach a skill with any of the service recipients? And you can just give me a yes or no in the chat. And if it's a no, that's totally okay. Just trying to gauge the audience. So yes, Kay, we can. Earl, if you could repost the skills teaching template in the chat, if you could add that in. So I'm getting some no's. I did get a yes from Carl. Carl, if you feel comfortable sharing a little bit about your experience and letting us know what worked well or what was challenging, please feel free to do so. I don't want to put you on the spot. But I do have a couple of people saying that they weren't here last week. So just to kind of give a brief overview, the skills teaching template is a form that we use that helps to really break down how to teach a skill. So typically we talk about skills teaching in the realm of tell, show, do, where we are discussing the steps and kind of telling the person that we're working with the steps of the skill. We're then modeling how to perform that skill, which is the show. And then do is having the person that you're working with um, practice the skill so that you can give feedback. The skills teaching template that Earl is going to put in the chat is a much more structured and detailed process. And the reason why we like using this template is because it really breaks it down. And even though not every person that you're working with is going to need a skill to be broken down in this way, there are definitely some folks out there who do need this. There are certain skills like maybe conversation or communication skills that are a little bit easier to kind of learn in the moment. But a skill like learning how to cook a meal or learning how to use an appliance, learning how to use something like a computer, right? That's something that can require more in depth steps. It can require a lot of steps. So, using the skills training template is something that can help. Kim, I also see that you noted in the chat that you were able to use the skills teaching template. Please feel free to share in the chat. Um, if you feel comfortable, what worked well, and maybe if there was anything that was challenging about using the template. Or also feel free to unmute yourself. So Kim said it was fairly easy to use. And we do appreciate that feedback because we do hope that when we provide you resources, that they are easy to use, not just for you, but also easily understandable for the folks that you're working with. So if you haven't gotten a chance to, definitely take a look at the skills teaching template. Carl said it was engaging according to the person that you were working with. So that's also really great feedback. I'm happy to hear that the tool helped to hopefully facilitate a good conversation between the both of you. One of the things that I personally really like about the skills teaching template is it really encourages you to think about and write down all of the steps that it takes to perform the skill. And that is something that can be really helpful for folks if they need it. Carl, you also said it allowed to feel natural while developing the skill. And Kim, you said my client didn't need all of the minute details, but it was a good way to reinforce for me the steps necessary. Yeah, and I'm happy you bring up that point, Kim, right? Because I do think that again, depending on the person, depending on the skill, you might not need all the information on it, but it can be useful to have to get in the habit of being mindful of more in-depth information for the individuals that do need it. So thank you so much, Kim and Carl, for sharing some feedback with your peers. I hope that this is a good encouragement for all of you to consider using the skills teaching template. And let's move on into our content for today. So, our learning objectives and what we're really going to focus on today. So, first, we're going to examine the stages of change framework and look at how it plays into examine the role. I missed the word role and that confused me. Sorry about that, folks. Examine the role the stages of change framework plays when selecting appropriate interventions. So we do talk about this a lot, and we may have mentioned it briefly in previous trainings, but it's really important to be mindful of the stage of change that the individual you're working with is in to ensure that the intervention matches that stage of change. We're also going to discuss and talk about intentional services and how important providing intentional services can be. We're going to then transition into documentation and discuss how to document consumer progress notes. And then we're going to apply the components of the DAP format to a progress note. So I know that this graphic is very, very familiar to all of you, but this is the golden thread of FCS, and we are in these last few boxes here. So we're at the point where we are now providing those intentional services. we're documenting those services, and then we're ensuring that the services tie back to the plan and ensuring that those services tie back to the assessment. And when you're documenting the services that you provided, something that you really want to make sure to include, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later as well, but I do want to just state it now, is you want to ensure that the goal and objective and interventions, right, are being included in that progress note. And if you're including the goal and the objective, that's going to ensure that the services and the progress note is linking back to the plan, because the plan also outlines that goal and that objective. And then you're ensuring that the services are tying back to the assessment, because the assessment should have some identification of the goal in it. So before we get into documentation, though, let's talk a little bit about the stages of change. So I'm going to ask folks, just generally speaking, what you know about the stages of change. Is this information? Does this sound familiar? Is it something you know really well? Is it something that you um, are somewhat familiar with? Let me know in the chat. All right, I'm getting a lot of very familiar. Um, People have an understanding, somewhat of an understanding. So, just to kind of give a broader explanation of the stages of change and what they are, if it is familiar to you, it might be in the context of mental health. Um, Chelsea, you said this came up in a training for motivational interviewing you took recently, and that makes a lot of sense. The stages of change is something that is very much discussed and talked about within the context of motivational interviewing. It's also something that is typically talked about in um, the realm of substance use. So for those of you who are saying it's familiar, I would, I'm guessing that maybe some of you, if not all of you, know this from substance use. And this is something that is used within substance use, and looking at substance use as being that behavior that is being changed. Okay, so there are 5 stages of change: pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance. And I'm going to go a little bit more in depth into these stages of change in a little bit. But I also want to highlight that the stages of change are fluid. Okay. So when we look at each of these stages of change, and on the next slide, it'll tell us a little bit more about what behavior looks like within each stage of change. But it's really important to recognize that behavior change is not linear. You could have somebody who you're working with that is very much motivated and willing and wanting to make a change one day, and then in another time period, in a day or two, or even in a week, feel very differently about it. An example that I like to use, that's a personal example, is there was a time in my life where I was trying to spend less money on DoorDash. How many of you here have issues with DoorDash and Uber Eats and just the simplicity of having food delivered right to your door? Yes, I'm getting some me's. Instacart. Yes, I'm getting some validation in the chat that this is very relatable. Yes. So there was a time not too long ago, at the beginning of the year, where I was very motivated to stop uh, door dashing food. And I did really good, right? I did great. I was on it for like a week or two. And then I couldn't get to the food store to buy food for myself. And I didn't have the motivation to go to the food store during the week. So then my motivation to keep up with this goal and keep pursuing this goal of not using DoorDash anymore went down the drain, right down the drain. And I think I DoorDashed like every a couple days that week, because I ordered like lunch and then had it for dinner and then so on and so forth, right? So I use this example and I hope that it's relatable that sometimes we have goals for ourselves and we're really motivated, and then something happens and the motivation isn't there anymore. And that's very much what's happening within the stages of change, right? I was in an action stage of change where I was motivated and taking steps to no longer DoorDash, but then I didn't plan my time well enough. And I was just like, this isn't a problem. It's fine for this week. I'm totally fine and happy to DoorDash this week. And I was right back in pre contemplation where I didn't see spending like $30, $40 a day on food as a problem, as a financial problem, which, spoiler alert, it was. That's a lot of money, right? So it's important to recognize that in that same way as that's what I experienced and maybe what some of you experience out there, that's the same thing for the people that we're working with, right? We're all human and the stages of change are fluid. People are going to fluctuate. Now, it can be a little bit more concerning when you are working with somebody who is actively using substances, right? Because there are some real dangers and consequences. So I do want to acknowledge that as well, right? When you have somebody who's not using substances and then goes back to using substances, that can be really concerning. Um, but when we're thinking about behavior change for some of the other individuals we're working with, right? It's natural. It is very natural to go from this place of wanting to make a change to not wanting to make a change. And then to that point, right? People do experience different levels of motivation. Oh, actually, no, this is a different point. The other thing I want to acknowledge is that people experience different levels of motivation for different goals. So you might have somebody who you're working with who has two goals on their service plan. And for the first goal, they might be, and again, in an action stage of change, they might be very motivated to work on that goal. For example, maybe it's a physical health goal around learning how to better manage their diabetes, right? They might be very, very motivated to do that because there's a lot of buy-in for them, right? Like this is something that is impacting their health. Maybe when their blood sugar is not regulated and kind of out of control, it's something that really impacts the way that they feel. They don't want to feel like that anymore. So they're really motivated to learn how to navigate and better manage their diabetes. But they might have another goal on their service plan that is more focused on cleaning their apartment. And they might not be motivated at all to clean their apartment, right? They might be more in a contemplation stage of change where they're like, I don't really have too much stuff, or, the sink isn't that dirty, or, I swept a couple of weeks ago. It's fine. I don't need to sweep again. Right. So people can have different levels of motivation for different goals. And it's important for us to recognize that because, one, again, it's natural. But two, we've definitely heard feedback from folks of kind of feeling frustrated on our part as to why are they so motivated to work on this goal but not motivated to work on this other goal. And I think we can all relate to that in the sense of, for me, I was not motivated to work on or to stop spending money on DoorDash, but I was motivated to work on other goals within my life, right? So it's human. It's part of the human experience essentially. And then the other thing I want to be very mindful of, and we're going to talk more about this on the next slide, is that interventions are determined by the stage of change. And when we're developing interventions on the service plan, we should really, really be mindful of what stage of change the person is in when we're developing these interventions. And I'm going to tell you a little bit why. So in this column here, we have the stage of change. And in this middle column, we have what it looks like, what behavior looks like in that stage of change. So if we were to use the example of maybe somebody taking medication, right? Somebody in a pre-contemplation stage who has a goal of taking medication, they're not going to see a problem in not taking the medication, right? They don't think they need to take the medication, even though maybe you as a staff person see that it could potentially be helpful for them to take medication. Maybe their friends and family are also voicing that to them. They don't see that as being a problem. Now, if that person were to transition into a contemplation stage of change, that's where they're acknowledging that there is a problem, but they're still struggling with this ambivalence. So that's where you're going to hear people kind of go back and forth. So you might meet with them one day and they might say, yeah, I do think that maybe taking medication might be helpful. I know in the past when I've taken medication, I've, felt a little bit better. I've, noticed that I haven't had as many symptoms. But then you might meet with them another day, maybe later in the week or in the next week, and they might say, "No, I don't know. I thought about it a little bit more, and I don't really think that I need to take the medication. I think I'm fine." When somebody is in a preparation stage, this is when the person has identified that they do want to make the change. And now they're really looking at the pros and cons and some of the benefits and barriers to change, right? So, in this stage of change, somebody maybe with a goal of taking medication is now recognizing, like, hey, taking medication is something that's going to help me. How can I go about doing this? What do I need in order to start taking my medication more consistently? So maybe they need a pill box. Maybe they are having some conversations with their pharmacist or their doctor about side effects, because maybe they're concerned about side effects. Maybe they are talking to their pharmacist about having them put the medication in the little blister pack so that they don't even have to worry about taking it. So they're making these steps where they're actually preparing to make this change. And then once the person is in action, that's when they're making the change and living the new behaviors. So for this person, they're taking their medication either every day of the week or maybe a couple of days of week. Typically, most people don't take their medication 100% anyway. I know I have that problem sometimes. I'm sure many of you can identify with that as well. So maybe we're talking like 6, 7 days a week. They're taking their medication consistently and they're doing so for 6 months. Once we get beyond that 6 month point, that's when we're in maintenance. That's when the person is maintaining the behavior change that is now integrated into their life. And they are continuing to take that medication. And Kay, I am happy to be that reminder for you. Because yes, people forget, right? So, in that example, right, I hope that was an example that kind of demonstrated the stages of change and what it could look like in some of the folks you're working with. But now I want to talk about where interventions come into play, right? So, we're working with this person, and let's say they're back in the pre contemplation stage of change and they don't see there is a problem. They don't really, again, feel like they want to take their medication. They don't think it's helpful. It's not really something they want to do. If But we have this as a goal on their service plan. They're like, yeah, whatever, put it on the service plan. If you were to put an intervention around like skill building, right? Maybe around filling their pill box with medication, that is a mismatched intervention, right? Because skill building is something that should be done more in an action stage of change, not when someone is in pre contemplation. And what we find happening is, and let me know if this is something that resonates with you, but what we've seen in some of the people we've worked with in New Jersey is that in that example, if the staff person were to put a skill building activity like filling their pill box every week with the staff on the service plan, what's happening is once the service plan is completed and signed off, and the staff are actually going out to meet with the person's saying, "No, I don't want to do that." Or no, I'm not interested in doing that today. I don't want to work on that goal. I don't want to work on that intervention. I don't want to do that with you. Does that resonate a little bit with anybody out there? Or maybe you've had something like a skill building activity on a plan and the person's just like, nope, I don't want to do that skill. Yeah. Now, I can't be for sure. I can't say for sure that this is exactly what's happening. And, you guys have much more knowledge around that than I do because I don't know the specific situations. But this is why it's really important to be mindful of the stage of change the person is in and the intervention that you're providing. For that person who's in more of a pre-contemplation stage of change, this is when you're just going and meeting with the person, and if they want to talk about taking the medication, then you talk about it with them, right? You're providing that outreach, you're still showing up, you're building that engagement, you're building that rapport with the person, you're providing them with any practical support they need. So maybe we're focusing on a different goal, right? Maybe we're focusing on a goal where they're more motivated. Maybe they're interested in finding a job, or maybe they're interested in volunteering. So we're focusing on working with that, and we're showing up and we're building that relationship with them. Maybe if they're open to talking about it, maybe you're just listening, right? We're not asking any questions. We're not trying to weigh any of those pros and cons yet, because they're not in a place where they're going to be open to that conversations. Maybe we're just listening, right? Maybe they're telling you about some experiences where they've had some bad side effects, or maybe they've, um, had experiences where they didn't really feel like the medication was working, and they tried to talk to a provider, and the provider wasn't listening, and they didn't feel heard, and that's why they don't want to take the medication, right? So we're just kind of listening to them, we're validating them, we're building on that relationship with the person. Once we start to hear that ambivalence, once the person starts saying, maybe I want to start taking medication, that's where we can move to this motivational interviewing and education. And it's the same for preparation, right? So if you have somebody in contemplation or in preparation, that's when we can start using those motivational interventions and education, right? So maybe we're providing the person with um, information on side effects for the medication, and helping them prepare questions for the pharmacist or for the doctor to ask about some of these side effects. Maybe we're helping them research other medications that are maybe in like a similar drug class and they think might be more appropriate for them. And again, helping them figure out how to have a conversation with the doctor so that they can have a conversation with the doctor about this other medication. Maybe we're just, again, exploring the pros and cons. We're using some motivational strategies, and we're focusing on, what are the benefits of taking medication? What are the drawbacks of taking medication? And helping the person get to the point where they're saying, hey, like I was doing really good when I was taking medication. And, I did have some side effects, but maybe they weren't as bad. Maybe it was things that I feel okay dealing with. Right. And then once we get into action, that is when we start employing some of these more intense interventions, as I like to call them, right? Skill building and kind of going through that process of learning a skill. I think it's very intense. That's my opinion. It's a lot. It's a lot for the person. It can also be a lot for you as you're trying to teach them and reinforce. Right? It's an in-depth process. So we want to make sure the person is in a good place, in a place where they want to perform this skill. Um, if that's the intervention that we're using. So that's where skill building comes in. That's where social support comes in. So maybe the person is talking some more with people at their program, or talking to other friends who are maybe on medication, and kind of talking with them about how that medication has helped them, and kind of reinforcing that for them. Maybe we're doing some cognitive behavioral interventions. Maybe the person, it does forget to take their medication, so maybe we're doing some behavioral tailoring to figure out how we can pair taking the medication with another behavior to ensure that they remember to take the medication. And then once the person is in maintenance, that's when we get into less work on our part, I guess, right? So that's just kind of like planning, helping the person again to continue to reinforce and figure out how they can continue to be successful in taking their medication every day. Maybe having conversations around if they're experiencing any barriers, maybe helping them to kind of problem solve how to work around some of those barriers, really helping to promote that recovery lifestyle and supporting the person in this case, continuing to take their medication, and then social support, right? So maybe the person is running a group at their program around medication education, or around, um, you know, um, how to take medication, or how to incorporate medication into a daily routine, because now they're the expert, right? They're the expert. They know what they're doing, and they want to share this information with other people and help some of their peers at their program. So, this is what it looks like, sort of in vivo, of how the stages of change can impact interventions. I want to ask, what are your thoughts? Does anybody have any questions? Does anybody have any feedback? Did my example make sense? Or is there anything I need to clarify? All right, awesome. All right. So, again, just to kind of reiterate, you want to make sure that the intervention is in alignment with the person's stage of change. And these are some of the reasons why, right? So, when the person is in the correct stage of change and the intervention matches the correct stage of change, the person is going to be more willing to take steps to work toward the goal. Whereas if the intervention is not in alignment with the stage of change, it's going to be misaligned then with the person's motivation. It could impact their wanting and willingness to work on that intervention. And it could just eventually lead to frustration for the individual and the staff person, right? So I also encourage you to think back to any personal goals that maybe you've been working on in the past couple of months, right? Has there been any maybe outside pressure to work on a specific goal? And thinking about how that made you feel, right? To kind of feel this outside pressure to work on a goal and not really feeling ready to work on it. And Carl, you bring up a really, really great point, right? A good relationship is key. If not, the person that you're working with can become defensive or they feel the need to work on the skill or not. Yeah, it's really important to continue to build and engage in that therapeutic relationship and ensure that you're really focusing on building that trusting relationship. Absolutely. So I hope that this information on the stages of change and stage-based interventions made sense. Um, we're going to transition into talking about intentional services. So if anybody does have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. So, in thinking about intentional services and intentional service delivery, the golden thread of documentation really highlights this idea and this concept of of intentional services. And it does so because intentional services are really best practice. So when we're thinking of intentional services and what they are, we're really thinking about purposeful, deliberate, and planned services. So when we're thinking about intentional service delivery, we're thinking about really being mindful of why we're going to meet with the person and what we're doing when we're meeting with the person and what our expected outcome is. Okay. So we're considering the intent or the energy or the philosophy that's driving the intervention. Why is it on the plan, right? Why is the person wanting to work on this goal and how is this intervention supporting this goal? Again, we're also thinking about the outcome, right? Like, how is the intervention that we're employing going to support the person in achieving their objective? And again, we want to be mindful of the method or the process that we're using as we're teaching this intervention. In New Jersey, before we moved to Medicaid fee for service, there were a lot of agencies that were not providing intentional services. So the agencies were maybe just providing a lot of transportation or a lot of going with people to doctor's appointments or going with people to like food shopping and not focusing on the why. Why are we doing this thing? How are we helping the person through providing this service? And I emphasize that because it's not to say that providing those services aren't good services because they can be, right? But we have to be intentional about it, right? So, are we just driving the person to the doctor's appointment? Or are we supporting them to be able to communicate better with their providers or advocate for themselves with their providers? Are we just going with them to the store? Or are we teaching them how to budget while they're in the store? Are we, you know, giving them and kind of providing information to them on different food related information, right? So, again, if the person maybe has high blood pressure or diabetes and they're on a specific diet from their doctor, how is the food that they're thinking of purchasing going to play into that? Are we helping to research foods prior to going to the store with the person, right? How are we being more intentional about providing services. And that's not to say that sometimes we're going to show up to meet with somebody and a crisis isn't going to occur, because it does. I don't want to say it always does. I don't want to jinx anybody. But crises do happen, right? And we do want to support the person when that happens. But it's also really important to have a plan when we're going out and meeting with somebody. Yeah, that's a great point, Q, right? So how low key depressing, how often just asking forward questions like what is that for? How does that help? Do they want that? Can take people up. Yeah, because sometimes um I say this because I know that this is something that I've done. So let me know if this doesn't resonate with all of you, right? But sometimes when we're meeting with somebody, right, I think we go into problem solving mode, right? We can go into problem solving mode. We go into that role of the helper. We want to help the person, we want to support the person. And sometimes we're just going through the motion and not really stopping and taking a breath to really think about some of these great questions that Q put in the chat, right? Like what is this for? How is this helping the person that I'm working with? Do they want this type of service? Is this service on the plan? Did they agree to this service? So, thank you for bringing that up, Q. So, to that point, when we're thinking about intentional service delivery, most of the services delivered should be on the ISP. So again, sometimes stuff happens. How many of you have showed up to somebody's apartment and they got a letter from the electric company that their electricity is being turned off. They got a letter from social services that their benefits are expiring. They got a letter from their landlord that they're being evicted. Is that happening to anybody? I hope that's not happening actually, but unfortunately, oh my gosh, Carl, it happened this morning. I'm so sorry. Right. So, or, maybe you're showing up and the person had a personal crisis, right? Maybe they got into a fight with a friend or a family member, or maybe they experienced a loss, right? We're meeting with human beings here, right? So sometimes we're going to show up and we're not going to be able to deliver a service on the ISP. But most of the time, that's what we want to be focusing on, right? The person met with you, they agreed to work on what is written down on the service plan, and that's what we really want to be focusing on. It's also really up to us as workers to plan what services are going to be provided during that visit. So it's best practice to take a look at the ISP before you go out and meet with the person. Take a look at, maybe, because I know you all have a lot of time, but maybe taking a look at the progress note from the previous visit. Was there any homework that needs to be followed up on? Is there anything that stood out from the last meeting that maybe it wasn't homework, but maybe you want to follow up on that's related to their plan? And you want to figure out what you need for that outreach, right? Do you need any to print out any materials? Do you need to have any websites readily available to share information? So you want to have a plan to of what's going to be provided during the visit, but also recognizing that sometimes plans change, right? Plans should also kind of be flexible. Um, and Q, that's a really great idea. Thank you for sharing that. You said I keep my clients' action plan goals in the notes on their contact in your work phone. That's a really great idea. Um, I'm floored by that idea. That's a really good use of technology. Thank you for sharing that. And then you want to make sure that as I said before, services other than those identified in the ISP are provided. But if other services are frequently needing to be provided, you might want to modify that ISP. So if you're meeting with a person and you're going out and, um, the first week of the month, there's a crisis, and the second week of the month, there's a crisis, and the third week of the month, there's a crisis, you might want to think like maybe we need to shift to skills or in education or what have you around managing crises. Do they need a safety plan? Do they need skills around problem solving? Do they need skill like coping skills related to like self regulation and figuring out how to cope with any intense feelings of anxiety or stress that are happening when this crisis is happening, and thinking about whether or not that needs to be put on the plan as a goal or one of the goals. Now, there are some benefits to intentional service delivery. So, when we're thinking about intentional service delivery, we're thinking of there being more of the plan driving service provision, right? So the plan really becomes this menu almost of services that we're going to provide. And again, services having a specific and intended outcome, right? Because these interventions that are on the plan are there to specifically support the person to achieve this objective. And once the person achieves this objective, then they're going to achieve their goal, right? So there is a specific intended outcome. When there's less intentional services provided, then we're seeing more of people being followed up with or people being checked up on. And again, sometimes we need to follow up on things. Sometimes people do need a quick check-in, but intentional services should be the majority of services that are being provided. So, if we have an example of a purposeful visit, right? We have instead of going to in on Bob, Bob and I are going to review how he is settling into his new apartment, and we'll review and practice the coping skills you taught him last week, right? This is the plan. So that's how you could reframe going to check in on Bob to making it a little bit more purposeful. How would we reframe this idea of dropping off Mary's meds? What might it look like? What do you think? Think about someone who you work with that maybe is like Mary, and something you support them with is dropping off medication. How can we make that into more of a purposeful visit? So, being proactive, how, Alma? What's a specific example? What might you do with Mary? So, Chelsea, you said discussing feedback on if dropping off her meds is helpful to her. Absolutely. How else can we make this purposeful? Oh, I like that, Sabrina. Checking in on how her medication management is affecting her housing stability. Absolutely. Carl said dropping off Mary's meds and checking in to see if she has any issues taking them as prescribed. Very good. Any others? Dropping off Mary's medication to help with her anxiety so she'll be able to manage it. Asking what is and is not working for her current situation, for her getting feedback on what the next goal or step is. Absolutely. And then we have Mary wants to discuss taking fewer medications. So we're outlining questions for her to discuss with her doctor next week. Right. So I think the other just kind of food for thought to consider when we're thinking about examples of purposeful visits or how to make or being mindful of having services be intentional is also really, excuse me, acknowledging and really thinking about all the work that you're doing. Because in your mind, you might just be dropping off Mary's meds. But in addition to that, you're discussing with her questions that she can ask her doctor next week. Or you're having conversations with her about what is working and what is not working about the medication, or barriers to her taking her medication. You're talking with her about her anxiety and maybe how the medication is helping her anxiety or not helping her anxiety, right? So it's also acknowledging all the good work that all of you are doing. Because I think sometimes we can think of it as like, oh, I'm just going to check in on Bob, right? But you didn't just go check in on Bob. You talked about how he's settling into his new apartment. You're talking about the coping skills that he's using. You're maybe asking him about his community, and maybe he's telling you about the neighbor he met, right? So it's acknowledging um, everything that you are doing with the individuals that you're working with when you actually go out and meet with them. And yeah, absolutely, Brian, right? Revisiting previous interventions to assess current stage of change. So let's do a little bit more practice. So let's think about Ralph. So Ralph is a 30-year-old male who has been diagnosed with bipolar disorder since his early 20s. He lived on his own in his early 20s. However, he was evicted from his apartment within a year and began living with family. Ralph is close with his parents, who have been supportive of him, but after discussing their living situation together, Ralph decided that he wanted to try living on his own again. He states that he's ready and looking forward to his new independence, but also finds the process daunting, and his symptoms of his depression have increased due to stress. So, this is Ralph's ISP. We have his goal that in the next 3 months, he's going to find an apartment within walking distance of his parents' home. This is the barrier. He has difficulty coping with stress, which is causing a lack of motivation. And then these are the different, this is the objective, and these are the different interventions. So I want you to take a look at these interventions, and I want you to put in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself. I want you to say what kind of intentional service you might be able to provide to Ralph. How can you take the interventions here and provide an intentional service to him? What's an example? So Kay said, working alongside him on finding coping methods that might help him with his stress. Absolutely. Education and support around stress related to change. Taking a road to renting class. That sounds like a very interesting class. I don't think we have anything like that in New Jersey. So that's really cool. Connect him to mental health resources. Absolutely. Any other intentional services? Carl, you said meet with Ralph and begin to develop daily living skills that will assist him in living independently. Yeah. An action step towards what skills he needs to be able to live by himself. Yeah. You guys are all on the right track, which makes sense because you all do this, right? So I think that I'm very happy to hear that. Any other types of intentional services? Look for places to live near his parents' neighborhood. Yeah, he's got to find an apartment, right? And I think other things to consider might be um, again, going through that like uh housing search process of finding an apartment and really thinking about his preferences for housing, thinking about maybe barriers related to successful tenancy, which I think the anxiety and kind of stress he's experiencing right now, like that's a barrier, right? So linking into teaching those coping skills. Um, we talked about that, yeah. And then Carl, you noted that maybe you would break that up into 2 goals, and yeah, I definitely think you could, right? You might have a goal focused specifically on stress and anxiety, or maybe the increase in his symptoms of depression, and then you might have another goal that's just focused on the housing stuff. Absolutely. All right. So I think that this is probably a good time to take a break. Because we're just about halfway through and we're going to be transitioning into documentation and progress note writing. So it's probably better for us to break here. So why don't we take 5 minutes and come back at 10:30. I hope that's correct in Washington time. All right, so we will be back in about 5 minutes. I'm just going to pause the recording, but I'll be here if anybody needs anything. All right, recording resumed. So, as I said before the break, we're going to transition to talking about documenting services and progress note writing. So, this is the last 3 sections of the golden thread of documentation. So, when we're thinking about documenting progress and um, some basic information around progress note writing, we want to make sure that progress notes are developed, I guess, or written is probably a better word, for each encounter. So every time you talk to a consumer or the person that you're working with, every time you meet with them, every time you go to their home and you knock on the door and they don't answer, you want to make sure that you have a progress note in their electronic health record that outlines that. You also want to make sure that progress notes have an emphasis on progress made or not made, right? So progress notes, it's in the title, right? Progress. They should really focus on um, how well the person is doing or how um, motivated the person is to work on their goal. Are they close to achieving their goal? Are they not close to achieving their goal? And why or why not? What's happening? You want to make sure that information is included. And you really want to make sure that information is included because Medicaid is paying for these services, right? So because Medicaid is paying for these services, they want to make sure that the services that they're paying for make sense. So we want to make sure that we're including in there any progress made or not made, because if Medicaid does come out and audit, that's some of the information that they're going to want to see and that they're going to be looking for. You also want to make sure that the progress notes describe interventions that are provided and the outcome, because again, this is information that Medicaid is looking for because this is why they're paying for these services. It's also good for the team to have this information, right? And then finally, you want to make sure that it has adequate content dependent on the services provided. So you want to make sure that there's enough information provided in the progress note that is going to match up with the amount of time you're spending with the person, as well as the interventions that you're employing. So if you're meeting with somebody for 15 minutes, that's probably not going to have as much detail as a progress note that is exploring or is describing an outreach that happened for 2 hours. Okay. When we're thinking about progress notes and progress note writing, it's also really important to think about the audience and think about who could potentially be reading these progress notes. So, you as the staff person are going to be reading this progress note, but also you might have colleagues or coworkers that are reading this progress note. If you're out and Earl needs to go and meet with the service recipient, it's important for Earl to have a clear picture of what happened in the last outreach so that Earl knows what to follow up on, so that Earl knows, how the person is doing, maybe any concerns that occurred during the last outreach. So you want to make sure that the information in the progress note is reflecting that. The progress note should really paint a clear picture of what happened so that anybody reading the progress note, whether that be your coworker, whether it be your supervisor, or whether it be an auditor, whether that be from Medicaid or anybody else who might come out and audit your organization, is able to clearly understand what happened during that outreach and during that encounter with the person. And yes, Tim, you bring up a really great point that clients and legal guardians also have access to their progress notes, right? So any of the individuals that you're working with can request to see their electronic health record. And the same way you could go to your doctor and request to see your electronic health record, they can also request to see that. So it's also important to be mindful that they can read it, as well as their legal guardian, if they have one, can also have access to that. Now, I don't highlight that to dissuade you from including information in the progress note because you definitely shouldn't do that. But it's important to be mindful of your language. It's important that when you're developing progress notes, that you're being mindful of the language that you're using, and that you're being objective as you're writing the progress note. And Laura, I see you have a question.
Yeah, so I'm curious, what we've been taught is that if it's an encounter over 15 minutes, we can bill for it. But can we only bill if the encounter is relevant to their service plan?
So that's a really good question. And I think I know the answer to that, which would be yes. You really should only be billing if it's related to the service plan. But Dawn, if you're out there, if you could chime in, because Dawn from HCA
Yeah,
is here.
I
Yeah.
am here. So just a little bit of background. I worked for a behavioral health agency for 21 years. During that period of time, we had a number of Medicaid audits. And when we did, the message that we heard is that if something emergent came up, a time or two, we could potentially bill for that. Kind of depending upon what it was. If it's housing related, then and billing to housing makes sense. If it's employment related, billing to supported employment makes sense. But if it was something that happened a time or two that was emergent, we could bill for it. If it happened more than that, it had to be put into the service plan in some fashion. Now, that's been my experience. I'm not going to say that's gospel, but based on the audits that we had, that was the information that I got. And I'm just curious if that's what other people have heard as well.
Thank you, Dawn.
Does that
Anybody
make
else?
sense?
Hey,
Yeah,
Emily.
it does.
Yeah, I was gonna echo what Dawn said. Generally, when an auditor comes into your agency, and basically, it's one of those things you're preparing for how you're going to be reviewed down the road. So ultimately, you should always ensure that the service you're providing is intentional, is dedicated to the and aligned with the ISP that you provide. But certainly, there's some allowance for crisis or unpredictable circumstance that relates to the person's ability to, function in that time. So if you consistently see a pattern of things being changed or adjusted every time you visit that person, you need to revisit your assessment and your plan to see if it really is reflective of that person's current circumstance, stage of change, and what's their priority, goals, and objectives.
Very well said, Earl.
Oh, okay.
Does that answer your question, Laura?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. And just to acknowledge in the chat, so yes, you are correct, Chelsea. Participants can pivot their goal, but you do want to make sure that there's documentation to support that pivot. And then Amanda echoed both what Dawn and Earl said as well, that it has to be and should be related to the client's goal service plan, because Amanda has also been through a couple of audits. And Chelsea said, so if they change what they want to include in their ISP, you just need to document that is what they want. You can bill for it. Yes, you do want to make sure that you are updating that documentation. And that's just also in good practice with the Golden Thread. Does anybody have any other questions around progress notes or billing or anything like that? Carl, I'm not sure what you mean by 30, 60, 90. I'm not sure if that's minutes or days.
Just that the ISPs have to be updated every 30, 60, 90, and in between should something occur or something change.
Mhm.
But they must be every 30, 60, 90 regardless.
Mhm.
The
Thank you,
ISP.
Carl.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we also talked about that. I think in the last session I facilitated in session 4, being mindful of what your organization's policy is around updating the ISP and how often it should be updated and reviewed. And that ensures that any changes are in there. All right. So the required elements of a progress note. So this is a general overview of the information that should be included in a progress note. So you want to make sure that you're including the goals that are addressed during the visit. And again, those goals should link to the goals on the ISP. You want to make sure you're including the types of interventions that were provided and the information related to that, right? So, why was this intervention provided, right? We know that it's related to the goal, but why are we working on this specifically? You also want to make sure that you're including the location of the service, whether that be in the person's home, whether that be in the community, whether that be a specific place in the community, like a library or like a food store. You want to make sure you're including the duration of the services. So, how much time was spent with the person, whether that be 120 minutes, whether that be 15 minutes. You also want to include the person's response to the intervention, right? So, how were they receptive or not receptive to the information, to the intervention, and also as evidenced by what? What makes you sure that the person was receptive? What makes you sure that the person was not receptive? You want to make sure you're including any plan for follow-up of what will happen next. Does the person have any homework that they're going to be completing for the next outreach? Is there anything that you need to follow up on, like any referrals, any resources that you need to acquire? And then the signature of the service provider. So your signature, including your title and your credentials. Does this information seem in alignment with the information that you all are providing in your progress notes? And this is like minimum also. I'm sure there's a lot more information that you guys are providing, and we're going to talk about that over the next couple of slides. But I'm getting some yeses. Good. So I'm happy that this makes sense. So there are a multitude of methods for writing progress notes. And we're going to talk specifically about DAP. But before I get into DAP, I do want to ask you all out there, what format are you using to write progress notes at your organization? What is your organization's preferred format? All right, we're getting a lot of DAPs. Okay, so Laura, you said each program does notes differently. Sometimes folks will also use DARP, which is Data Assessment Response and Plan. Sabrina, you said Goal Intervention Response Plan. Alma, you said SMART. I'm wondering if you're referring to SMART goals. Yeah, okay. I know in the past we've also seen DIP, which is Data Intervention Plan. Oh, Natasha, you have Detail Assessment and Plan, which is like DAP, but like DAP's cousin. We've also seen SOAP is something that is also used in some areas, though not the preferred method, I think, which is Subjective Objective Assessment Plan. There's another one that I've seen from Washington, but I can't remember what it's called. But I'm not seeing anybody in the chat say that. So it sounds like a lot of people are saying DAP. So for those of you who are saying DAP, this is probably going to look familiar to you. Even I think for you, Natasha, this is probably going to look familiar as well. But DAP format really refers to Data Assessment and Plan. So in the data section, you're including the specifics of the specific services and intervention provided. You're also ensuring a clear connection to the related goals, objectives on the plan. And then you're also including the who was there, where the service was provided, and the amount of time spent. So when we're thinking about DAP, we're really thinking about the who, what, where, and when. So you're talking about who was there, right? You're meeting with the person, where you're meeting with them, and what you're meeting with them about. So what interventions did they employ? What was their feedback? What did they say is currently going on in their life? Is there anything that they're struggling with? Is there anything they're really happy about? Again, linking to the interventions that are on the service plan and ensuring that you're including those interventions in there. And then Carl, you said data, is it linked to a goal from ISP? The objective, homework, follow-up from the last visit, specific objective or intervention noted, and what was the person's report? Yeah, so that's information that is included in the data, and I think that's very much in alignment with what I'm saying, Carl. So I'm happy to hear that because it means we're on the same page. So this is the information that we're including in the data section. In terms of the assessment, this is where we're including the consumer's response to the intervention or the outcome, any assessment of progress towards the ISP goals and objectives. So are they making progress? Are they not making progress? And again, why? And any assessment of change in consumer behavior. Now, in terms of the consumer response to the intervention, again, this is where you're ensuring that you're providing evidence. So if you're saying in the data section that the person was really angry and frustrated because their electricity was turned off and you supported them to call the electric company and the electric company is not going to turn the electricity back on until they make a $25 payment, but the person doesn't have $25 and they're really upset, and you put in the assessment section that the client was satisfied with the outcome, that's not really going to match up, right? If we're talking in the data section about them feeling really frustrated and upset, but then talking about them being satisfied in the assessment, that's going to be really confusing to somebody reading the progress note, because they're going to be like, well, what do you mean they were satisfied? You just noted that they were feeling frustrated, right? But if we were added in, consumer was satisfied with the outcome as evidenced by them thanking staff or thanking staff for reaching out to their supervisor to loan the consumer. Not that I think we should be. I don't. No, let me not say that. For staff, consumer was receptive to the intervention, as evidenced by thanking staff for linking them to a community resource that is willing to pay the balance on their electric bill. That makes more sense, right? So even though they experienced that frustration and being upset at the situation, it sounds like there was some resource that the staff linked them to that then they were happy about and receptive to. So you want to make sure that the information connects between the data and the assessment, but also that you are providing that evidence to support what you're saying. And then, yeah, absolutely, Carl, right? So what are the person you're working with? What are their strengths? What are their barriers? What are you observing as the staff regarding during service delivery, and what their stage of change is? Yeah, I think so. To your point, right, in terms of the assessment of progress towards goals, right, this is where we're talking about any barriers. This is where we're talking about any challenges maybe the person is experiencing related to their ability to work toward their goals, or maybe they're not experiencing any barriers at the moment. Maybe they are really motivated, right? Per their stage of change. Maybe they're in an action-based stage of change, they're utilizing resources, and they're making a lot of progress. But if, again, maybe one of their barriers is the fact that they're not motivated because they're in a contemplation stage of change, right? So that's also where you would include the stage of change. And then in terms of the assessment of change in consumer behavior, we typically get some mixed feedback on this. Our thoughts on this is, at the minimum, you really want to document a change in behavior if there is a change. So this is not something you necessarily need to document every single time you meet with the person, because if their behavior hasn't changed, it's not something you necessarily need to document. But if the person's behavior has changed, then you want to make sure that you document it. However, we've also heard from organizations that the organization wants this documented every single time you meet with the person. They want it documented, what their appearance looked like, what their affect looked like, what their thought process was. They want all of this included in the progress note, in every progress note. What are your experiences with assessment of change in consumer behavior? Is this something that you all have to document in every progress note, or is this something that's more documented as needed? Okay. So Carl and Alma said most. Teresa said documented as needed. So the reason why I like to ask this question and just kind of gauge the audience is you want to do what your agency says. First and foremost, if your agency is requiring you to document this in every single progress note, keep doing that. But if it is as needed, that's okay too. Some agencies do things differently. And then Okoye, you said you document specific behaviors almost all the time because it's important to document consistent behaviors at your agency. And then Alma, you said depending on the case. Yeah, and that's why it really is depending on your agencies and your organizations, because I know a lot of you have a lot of different programs. There's a lot of different populations that you all serve. And it's important to make sure that you're documenting per the needs of the individuals you're providing services to. Okay. And then the last part of DAP is the plan. And this is my favorite part of the progress note because it's easy. It's the staff and consumer next steps, it's the date and time of the next service delivery, and it's the plan. Okay. So you're documenting what your next steps are, you're documenting what their next steps are, you're documenting the date and time of the next service delivery, and that's it. That's your plan. Now, in terms of the date and time of next service delivery, How many of you out there have to document this? Are you encouraged at your organizations to be specific that you're going to meet with the consumer on this day and this time? Okay. I'm getting a lot of yeses. Angela, you said date, not time. So what I will say for those of you who are documenting the date and time, you want to make sure that if you are documenting the date and the time, that even if you don't meet with the person on that next date and time for whatever reason, that you have a progress note documenting that. Because if you are saying that you're going to meet with, if I'm saying in a progress note that I'm going to meet with Earl on May 27th, then I need to have a progress note in my electronic health record stating that either I met with Earl on May 27th, or I spoke to Earl and Earl said he didn't want to meet, or I went to Earl's apartment and I knocked on his door and Earl did not answer. Okay. It's really important that there's that continuity documented in your electronic health record, because unfortunately, we have to be mindful of liability, because if something happens to a consumer and you're saying that you're meeting with them and you don't document that you went out there to meet with them, that you called them, et cetera, it could have some potential fallback. Okay. I can speak to a specific example that I experienced in New Jersey. I was working with a consumer who had, the service recipient had just been discharged from the hospital. And my staff had met with them on a Friday. They said they didn't want to be seen again until that next Tuesday. And over the weekend, they passed away. And in New Jersey, when a service recipient passes away, regardless of the cause, there's an incident report that we have to file with the state. And we were able to document on that incident report that we had a progress note saying that we were not going to meet with them until that day. And that was the next day and time we showed up. And that's when we found out that unfortunately the person had passed away. So it's really important that there's that continuity of services. So Amanda, you said my notes have to be dated and the time. We have to enter a plan for what client will be doing between now and our next appointment. That's part of the Golden Thread as well. Samantha, we were required to document if the client cancels, et cetera, when we were supposed to have our next session. Yes. Sabrina, yeah, that happened with one of my clients too. So it sounds like this is what's happening out there. For those of you who have noted in the chat, so I'm happy to hear that, but I just want to highlight that you really want to be mindful of that and making sure that if you are putting that date and time in the progress note, that there is documentation showing that you tried to have that follow-up. Okay. So this is our DAP checklist. And Earl, I'm going to ask if you can put it in the chat. And this is something that we like to share with folks as a reminder tool, essentially, that you can use when you're writing your progress notes. And it outlines all the information that should be included in the data, the assessment, and the plan, as well as a general checklist. So it's asking you, is it linked to a goal from the rehabilitation plan? Was homework follow-up, or was there homework or follow-up from the last visit? Were the staff-specific interventions noted? What was the consumer's report, right? So it reminds you all the information that should be included. And then it has just some general information, right? So is it dated and signed? Is it strengths focused? Is all the information, especially the consumer name, spelled correctly? Would someone not familiar with this person be able to read this note and understand exactly what has occurred during service delivery, right? What I also really like about this checklist is you can sort of edit it. So you can add things in or you can delete things. So my staff, when I was working in supportive housing a couple years ago, what my staff would do is they would delete the items that they knew they were always putting in their progress notes. and they would only leave on the checklist the things that they knew they often forgot to include and that they needed to check themselves for. Making sure that they linked the goal, right? That was something that sometimes my staff forgot to put in. So that was something that they would always leave on the checklist. Making sure that they were including progress was something that they kept in. Making sure that they included what they were going to do next was something that they often left in. So Alana, I'm happy that you like this. And again, feel free to edit it, right? If there's additional information that your organization wants you to include in the checklist, add it in. It's definitely something that can be modified based on your organization. Thank you, Tim. Have a good one. Thank you for being here with us. But it's something good to keep in mind, especially if you're someone out there who's newer to the field. Maybe you haven't been working in community mental health or FCS for a very long time. This is something good to kind of have on hand just to make sure that you're including all the information in the checklist. Okay? So yes. What I will do, Laura, is before I send this over, I'm going to link the checklist here. So right up here, I will link the checklist, and I'll also make sure that it does get sent with the items that we send over with the PowerPoint to make sure that you guys have access to this. All right, thank you, Julie. All right, so this is an example progress note format. Okay, so this is how you could potentially format a progress note. You don't have to format it this way, but this is just an example. So you have the goal up top, making sure that it corresponds with the goal from the treatment plan. You have your intervention. So the interventions are directed by the goals and objectives. Interventions include activities or support provided towards the goals and objectives. You have the location. You have the response to the intervention. So again, where any descriptions of the results of the interventions, barriers, description of how symptoms or functional limitations affected the person, and then that signature and title. And if we look at this, nope, go back. This is the information based on the DAP, right? So these first three sections are really in alignment with the data. All this information would be included in that quote unquote data section of the progress note. And then the response to the intervention here is where we have that assessment and the plan. Okay, so ensuring that all the components of the DAP note are in there. Okay, so before we get into our activity, I want to ask, does anybody have any questions about the DAP format, about progress notes, anything like that before we get into the activity?
Our case notes are virtual, and so we enter them under our own name, right? Like me, like Laura is the name attached to the case note, but there's no title. So, like, how do you do a signature and title if it's not handwritten?
So I think in the electronic health record that I was using, everybody's title was kind of imprinted when we put in our signature. So like mine would say Emily Bands, it would say my credential, and then under that it would say program manager. So that was something that was built into our electronic health record. But if your electronic health record doesn't do that, then that's probably okay.
It's not like mandatory.
I don't think it's mandatory based on your like regulations. I think it's just kind of best practice, which is why we talk about it.
Okay.
Natasha also says that they use initials in their signature. Carl, yes, ours is also. So again, there is going to be some variation between organizations. What I would recommend you definitely do is if you do have questions, reach out to your Washington Healthcare Authority representative. and ask any questions around whether or not that's something you need in your electronic health record, or ask your supervisor if this is something that they have talked about within the agency. I know that when organizations find the electronic health record they're using, they usually tell the electronic health record company everything that they need to be included. So I wouldn't be too worried if it's not something that's included. All right. So we're going to go back to Ralph. And any other questions before we do the activity? All right. So we're going to go back to Ralph, and we're going to remember what Ralph's plan looks like. So he wants to find an apartment within walking distance of his parents' home while learning ways to manage symptoms of his bipolar disorder. Okay. We have the objective and the interventions here. So let's say we meet with Ralph to work on his goal of focusing on the intervention of him attending a bi-weekly education and training session for 30 minutes on the role, rights, and responsibilities of the tenant and landlord. Okay, so that's what we're meeting with Ralph for. Where he's attending this, we're providing this education to him and training on the role, rights, and responsibilities of the tenant and landlord. He talks about how his symptoms have been this week and what has recently been causing him to feel stressed. We provide education to him on what his role is as a tenant and some of their responsibilities. He wrote down some questions we were both able to find answers to. And during the next session, we're going to review his tenant rights and call his contact at the Washington State Housing Authority to have his questions answered. Okay? So, how would we write a progress note for Ralph? Do we remember what? Actually, I'll give you that. So we know what Ralph's goal is. His goal is to find an apartment within walking distance of his parents' home while learning ways to manage symptoms of his bipolar disorder in the next 3 months. We know that he attended a bi-weekly education and training session for 30 minutes given by me on the role, rights, and responsibilities of the tenant and landlord. We know we met with him in the community. So how would we write a progress note for Ralph? Put some things in the chat. What are some of the things we did with Ralph? And if you want, I can go back to the last slide. So yes, Carl, we welcomed him to the session. Absolutely. Here, I'll go back to this. So not in this session, Susan. So we didn't look online for apartments in the area. In this session, we provided him education on what his role is as a tenant and some of the responsibilities. And then we also talked about his symptoms and what they were over the past week. And he looked at some questions that we weren't able to find answers to. So how would we write this in a progress note? What are some thoughts? So Amanda, you said writer assisted client with making progress on his goal by providing education to client on what his role is as a tenant. You might also document if he contacted Washington State Housing Authority. Absolutely. We might also talk about what materials we used. If there was like a specific program or a specific booklet that we used or a specific website to that gave us the information of what his role is as a tenant and the responsibilities. What else? I think it's Alana met with client in the community, conducted research, and provided education with client around tenant roles and responsibilities. Talked about and reviewed symptoms of client's mental health and wrote down questions and answers for mental health. Plan is to review tenant rights and responsibilities and call Washington State Healthcare for more information. Absolutely. Heather, you said I would note Ralph's appearance and demeanor. I would note what we specifically went over with challenges and progress made. And then I would wrap up with next steps to accomplish that are client-driven goals. I would give resources and specify when we are meeting next. Teresa, you would outline the questions he is looking to get answer for. Carl talked with Ralph about his understanding of his role as tenant and role-played situation that may arise as one lives independently. I love that. Talked with Ralph about what he found out about questions we were unable to answer at last session. Absolutely. And I love that you threw in role-playing in there, Carl. That's a great intervention to use. Anybody else have any ideas? I'm going to go back to this slide. And I'm going to share what I have. So if it was me meeting with Ralph, this is what I would document in the progress note. So writer met with individual for his biweekly education and training session for 30 minutes. Ralph voiced having difficulty managing symptoms of his bipolar disorder this week. More specifically, his stress levels have increased, which has caused an increase in the depressive symptoms he experiences. Additionally, Ralph stated he has been thinking a lot about his previous eviction and is concerned about his role and responsibility as a tenant. Writer used handouts from Washington State Housing Authority to educate individual on his role as tenant in an apartment, as well as some of his responsibilities. When he had questions, writer and individual collaboratively reviewed the Washington State Housing Authority website, and if he was unable to find an answer, he wrote down the questions. Individual reported significantly reduced levels of stress as he stated he feels more informed about his role and responsibilities. During the next biweekly session, writer and individual will review his rights as a tenant and call his contact from the Washington State Housing Authority to have his written questions answered. So I want you guys to take a look at what I wrote and what's missing. Is there anything missing? Is there anything that you feel like is unclear, maybe, and doesn't 100% make sense? And Sabrina, I just want to acknowledge what you wrote in the chat. That looks very much in alignment with what we would see in a progress note. So yeah. And when you say mental health assessment, do you mean an assessment that I'm facilitating, or do you mean Ralph going for a mental health assessment outside? Yeah, and that might be something that makes sense, right? So that could 100% be something that was included, right? So after he voiced having difficulty managing symptoms of his bipolar disorder, we might say that we explored the pros and cons of Ralph um, seeing his psychiatrist for a mental health assessment, or maybe finding an outside therapist and seeing a therapist or a counselor for a mental health assessment. And then maybe for the follow up, um, the follow up is me as a staff person finding some referrals for him and providing that for him at the next session. So, yeah, I definitely think that could be included. Anything else? And again, I want to ask, does this seem in alignment with what you all are documenting in your progress notes? Also noting that everybody writes differently. Everybody has their own style. So don't, pay too much attention to that. So Kaylin said yes. And I want to ask that because I want to reaffirm for you all, right, that if this is, similar and kind of in alignment with what your guys are doing, you guys are on the right track. Okay, so Sabrina, for your organization wants you to have a direct client quote to show choice in services and goals. So that would be something you would definitely have to include. Thank you for sharing that, Sabrina. Does any other agencies require quotes? And Susan, you said new to the role as housing specialist, but feel like my notes are getting better and more detailed each time. Yeah, and you also have to have quotes. Yeah. And you know what? I think you bring up a really good point, Susan, that I also want to reiterate for other maybe newer folks to FCS, that yeah, it takes time, right? It takes time. It takes maybe getting some feedback from your supervisor, maybe reading some of your colleagues' notes who maybe have worked in the field a little bit longer, to really get into a good practice of knowing how much information to include, or how much information to not include. And then Erica posed a question to the group. Does anybody have any limits or rules for length of notes? And Kay, you said they're not required for us, but encouraged to use exact words where we can. Absolutely. And I think it for good reason, right? When you're using quotes, or we're highlighting specifically what the service recipient is saying, we are showing their participation, right, in the services, and really providing those person-centered services, because we're focusing on them and what their individual experience was during this outreach. And then Samantha, you said we are always supposed to start out DAP notes with today the writer met with client at a location, time was spent in supportive housing session to support the client by blank, and they always want at least direct quote. Okay. Yeah, so it sounds like a lot of your organizations have some specifics on how they want notes written. So you definitely want to follow that. Whatever your organization is saying on how they want you to write progress notes, definitely do that. Carl is saying there is no length, that they just want it to match the narrative with the amount of time spent. Kim, you noted your verbose and detailed. You have had occasion in the past when I've been told notes are too long. It's hard though, Kim. It's really hard to kind of figure out, you know, how much information is too much information. So I empathize with that. And yeah, Jackie, you definitely also, the start and end time is definitely something to include. Hopefully your electronic health record is including that. And Sabrina, you said not entirely, but it's suggested to keep them clear, concise, tie them to housing stability, but don't want them too long because auditors don't want to read unnecessary information. Yeah. All right. And then I just wanted to provide one more example of what a progress note might look like. So let's say we're meeting with Ralph to work on his goal, focusing on the intervention of assisting him with reviewing available housing options in the community that meet his identified preferences and to compile a list of information and documents required by housing applications. He discusses with us what has recently been causing him to feel stressed. You collaborate to create a list of units within a 15-minute walking distance from his parents' house. You also collaborate to create a step-by-step instruction guide of what information he needs for housing applications. He expressed feeling less stressed around searching for a new apartment and will meet with you tomorrow to review information and documents needed to apply to an apartment as well as apply for an apartment. And this is what a note might look like. So again, the goal is included, the specific intervention is included, the location, and then what happened. So individual stated he has had difficulty managing symptoms of his bipolar disorder, especially the stress caused by thinking about how to determine what housing options are available to him and how to go about applying for any vacancies. With assistance, he was able to create a list of available housing units he is interested in within a 15-minute walk of his parents' house. In addition, staff and an individual collaborated to create a step-by-step instruction guide of what information he needs to gather to fill out each housing application. Individual reported significantly reduced stress surrounding his housing search and will meet with staff tomorrow to review information and documents needed to apply, as well as to apply to one apartment complex. And then the signature and the title. So just providing you another example of what a progress note might look like based on a scenario. And I want to highlight what Kay said in terms of you can't please everybody. At the end of the day, right, progress notes we want to make sure we're doing what our organizations say. We want to make sure that we're including the information that we need to include. But at the end of the day, in terms of like with auditors, you never know what kind of auditor you're going to get. And when I say kind, I mean, you don't know if you're going to get a kind auditor, an actual kind auditor. You don't know if you're getting an auditor that maybe is a little bit more stringent and maybe a little bit more by the book. You just don't know what you're going to get in terms of with an auditor. One auditor might come out and might think your progress notes are great, and a different auditor might come out and say, no, I don't like this. So it really is hard. So just kind of keeping in mind that as long as you're doing what your organization says, as long as you're following your supervisor's feedback, as long as you're being mindful that, you know, the information you're including in the progress note is painting a clear picture of what happened, as long as you're being mindful of the language that you're using, because you know that the person you're working with might read the progress note, your colleagues are reading the progress note, as long as you're being mindful of all those things, you're all on the right track. And then just being mindful of errors. Errors are something that you want to be mindful of because as we're speaking about auditors, errors are something that can open us up for further, I guess, inspection by an auditor, right? When Medicaid is coming out to audit, they're looking at specific charts. But if there are a lot of errors in the charts that they're reading, that can essentially give them the authority to look at more charts. So we don't want that. You don't want that. You don't want them to look at more than what they're already coming to look at. Okay. So you want to focus when you're charting. You want to focus when you're writing your progress notes because we're liable for errors even if they're unintentional. Okay. You want to make sure you're reviewing the date and time of service for errors. Something that was a huge issue at my old agency, when we transitioned to a new electronic health record, was people were putting in their progress notes that they were meeting with consumers or the service recipients from 1 a.m. to 2 a.m. because people were forgetting to change the a.m. to p.m., right? And that was clearly an error. Nobody was meeting with any individuals in the middle of the night. But that's an error, and that could potentially be a concerning error to an auditor, okay? So you want to make sure the date and time of service are correct. You want to ensure that the date, the service type, Again, how much time you're meeting with the person, the start time and the end time, the staff information, and the location are all included. You also want to ensure the intervention reflects the appropriate identified goal, right? You want to make sure that the intervention is in alignment with the goal because it has to make sense, right? We do have to follow that kind of golden thread of a service plan where the goal, objective, and intervention make sense and are connected. And again, you want to remember that errors can open up agencies to increase scrutiny and more oversight, and that makes room and leaves more room for repayment. Okay. We don't want them to look at any more charts than they're already coming to look for. So just be mindful of any errors and make sure you're proofreading. Make sure that your pronouns are the preferred pronouns and the pronouns that the person wants. Sometimes I had staff who were charting very quickly and they weren't really paying attention to the person that they were writing about. And instead of using he as a pronoun for a service recipient who that was their pronoun, they were saying she accidentally because they were thinking of another service recipient that they also needed to write a note for, right? So take your time, make sure you're focused, and make sure that you're being mindful of errors. Okay? So that's all we have for you. Earl is going to put the evaluation in the chat box. I am going to just put it out there, blanket, for any questions. If you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But I am just going to thank everybody. We do appreciate your time, attention, and participation. I do want to highlight that today's webinar was hosted by DVHR through the Washington Healthcare Authority. We would like to remind you that slides, a link to the recording of the session, and a wealth of other resources is available and will be available in the follow-up email. Don't forget to check out the Foundational Community Supports newsletter for all things FCS, and any upcoming training events. And if you would like more information on becoming an FCS provider, please reach out to WellPoint. I am going to stop the recording.